So now we want to talk about ways to reduce water pollution. Now, this week you completed a lab that showed some tests of water quality on different types of water. And the water from different sources had different pollutants in it. And there were things that you could add to the water to help it become clean and make it suitable for human consumption. Now, we can do that. We can certainly treat sewage. We can add things to water to neutralize certain pollutants or to change the pH and make it so that we can use it. But these are all expensive methods. And in addition to saving money, preventing water pollution is a better solution because it also cuts the harm that these pollutants cause in natural waterways before we remove the water in order to consume it. Okay, so both surface water and groundwater can become polluted. Let's define what we mean by water pollution. Water pollution is any change in water quality, whether it's something added to the water or something that changes the pH outside of a normal range. And the result of this substance being added to the water makes it unsuitable either for the living organisms that would normally live there or from human uses, such as drinking the water or using that water for irrigation of crops or for recreation. So if you wouldn't want to swim in that water, it's polluted. Types of pollution include point sources and non-point sources. So point sources are specific identifiable locations that empty certain substances into the water. So maybe this is a factory that dumps wastewater into a lake or a river. Or maybe it's a sewage treatment plant that after the water has been completely treated, it empties the tertiary wastewater or the water that's been treated with 3 different methods into a natural water body. Non-point sources are diffuse areas or areas where the pollution is spread out over a very wide area. So we don't always know exactly where this pollution is coming from since it's coming from so many different directions. That means it's very difficult to identify and control non-point source pollution, and it's very expensive as well. So examples of non-point source pollution would be runoff from agriculture. Let's say that a storm comes and all of the farm fields in a particular watershed have some soil lost, and that soil enters the water and brings with it things like fertilizer and pesticides. The most important causes of water pollution include agriculture, industrial facilities like factories, and mining. Okay, recall from our previous chapter on mining that the finely ground overburden from mining creates a lot of fine materials that releases toxic metals that are buried in the rock layers into the water. There are also a number of chemicals used in mining that eventually end up in waterways. Remember that we talked about acid mine drainage? That's one way that water becomes too acidic for organisms to live there. So table 11.1 identifies major types of water pollutants. Okay, so these are major categories of the types of things that enter water bodies and cause problems. Okay, each type has some examples and some major sources. Just look at how many different types of categories are included. Okay, we have infectious agents or pathogens, anything that causes diseases. These tend to be living organisms. They can cause problems. We have excessive nutrients and material that when it breaks down uses up too much oxygen and deprives the water of oxygen. Nutrients might sound like a good thing, but they actually cause problems for water bodies that are typically low in nutrients, and they can't survive and the organisms that live there can't survive these extra nutrients in the system. We also have organic chemicals and inorganic chemicals, okay, coming from industry and households. Sediments are things like tiny pieces of rock or soil that tend to come from erosion as well as from exposed dirt in farm fields or from mining wastes. Okay, and remember that heavy metals can also become pollutants, and even warming up the water too much causes what we call thermal pollution. Okay, let's say that we're using the water from a local water body to cool a nuclear power plant. Okay, that can heat up the water too much and make it unsuitable for the animals that would normally live there. Okay, let's talk about how pollutants flow through certain water bodies. Now, even without human influence, there would be low levels of pollutants in natural systems. And therefore, natural systems have ways of cleansing themselves of these pollutants. So streams and rivers are water bodies that are naturally flowing. Water is going to flow from a higher area to a lower area in a riverbed or a stream bed. So it's sort of a narrow channel that water is flowing through. So since water is always entering these streams and rivers through runoff or through smaller bodies of water that enter the bigger streams and rivers, we have dilution, okay, or more water basically lowering the concentration of any pollutants that exist there. We also have naturally occurring bacteria in the river. So these naturally occurring bacteria are going to break down or biodegrade wastes, okay? So nature will eventually break down any pollutants that come into the river. However, some of the pollutants that humans put into natural water bodies don't break down as quickly as naturally occurring pollutants. Also, when there are high concentrations of pollutants put into a stream or a river, particularly when they're continually put in over and over again, such as a factory that constantly discharges pollutants or intermittently discharges the pollutants frequently, let's say that every day waste is dumped at a certain time, these streams and rivers can't handle that type of pollution load. There are also problems in streams or rivers when the rivers get low because of droughts, dams above the river that prevent water from entering the river at a fast enough rate, or the water being diverted away from the stream or river for things like drinking water or to use that water for another purpose, like irrigation. When the flow is reduced, we don't have that ability to dilute out the pollutants. As the bacteria are working to decompose certain pollutants, if too much of the pollutant is available and causes the bacteria to multiply to too high of a level, we can then have the depletion of dissolved oxygen. Or dissolved oxygen gets too low because the bacteria are using it up. That means that the naturally occurring organisms in that water body are threatened. A lot of the most sensitive organisms use a lot of oxygen, and they rely on high levels of oxygen in order to survive. So until those bacteria are done cleaning up the water and the levels of bacteria go down, a lot of organisms in the water body are threatened and won't survive. Water flows through lakes and reservoirs differently than through streams and rivers. Streams and rivers are relatively fast flowing, whereas lakes and reservoirs fill up and the water is much more stagnant. So the water doesn't enter and leave at as fast a rate. So pollutants can build up even faster in lakes and reservoirs. We also have what are called stratified layers. Based on different densities of water occurring at different temperatures, you get the coldest water sinking to the bottom of the lake or reservoir and warmer layers on top. And that water gets kind of stagnant, staying there rather than circulating throughout the lake or the reservoir. Okay, it does tend to circulate more in the fall and the spring when temperatures are rapidly changing, but during the summer it can get very stagnant. So this means that pollutants, especially high nutrient levels in lakes, when they're near the sources of pollution, especially agriculture and cities, that means that nutrient levels can get extremely high. Sometimes this causes bacteria and algae to grow to too high a level and oxygen levels to become extremely low, even lower than in a stream or a river. When this happens, we often see large numbers of fish and invertebrates dying off. This can also occur in marine environments. Out in the ocean, there can be dead zones. Okay, we saw this in the example of the Gulf of Mexico at the beginning of this chapter in our case study. Too many nutrients in the Gulf of Mexico means that the ocean areas near the coast of Louisiana and other Gulf of Mexico states is depleted of oxygen due to too much nutrients. Here's an actual picture that shows the different levels of dissolved oxygen. The lowest levels are shown here in red. And it's why we have problems harvesting fish and shellfish in this area at many times of the year. Groundwater causes even more of a problem for pollution control than lakes and rivers. Pollution in groundwater is even more of a problem than in lakes or reservoirs. Groundwater, pollutants found in groundwater break down even more slowly because of the cooler conditions underneath the ground, lower concentrations of decomposing bacteria in areas that generally don't have much oxygen, and that means that it can take up to thousands of years for polluted groundwater to cleanse itself of the same amount of pollution that might only take months or weeks to be broken down in a stream or river. Here are some potential solutions to preventing groundwater pollution. We need to find substitutes for toxic chemicals and use things that fill the same purpose but don't cause as many problems for aquatic life or for the humans that want to drink that groundwater. We also want to prevent these chemicals from ever entering the groundwater, okay? So maybe containing them when we use them and finding a way to break them down on land before they enter the water is a good idea. Okay, we can also try to prevent leaking of underground tanks like septic tanks or oil tanks that are used to heat houses. And we also want to take our wastes and dispose of them in landfills rather than dumping them directly into the water. If instead we've messed up and some pollution has entered the groundwater, we can sometimes use special microorganisms to clean up contamination. Or we can even drill and pump the pollutants to the surface, but that's much more expensive. than any type of prevention. We're still developing new ways of cleaning up pollution in groundwater. Pumping nanoparticles of organic compounds to help neutralize pollutants is an exciting new area of research, but it's still not a reality yet. If we have water collecting in a reservoir that we're planning to use for drinking, we can protect forests and wetlands elsewhere in that watershed that helps the water get cleaner before it arrives in the reservoir. So in a way, we're protecting terrestrial and aquatic habitats all at once. And that's a really wonderful solution. We can also take the water from a reservoir and clean it up using microfiltration or passing the water through a very fine membrane that removes pollutants from it. Or we can use reverse osmosis. Remember how we talked about reverse osmosis? In what process was that? Do you remember from an earlier lecture in this chapter? Okay, hopefully you said reverse osmosis was one of the methods used for desalination. It can also be used to remove pollutants instead of salts from water. We can also treat the water and remove microorganisms by concentrating ultraviolet light to sterilize it, or by adding the chemical hydrogen peroxide. While these are possible methods, it's always preferable to prevent the pollutants from entering the water in the first place. Thankfully, we have some laws to help protect our water from pollution. Although they weren't introduced until 1975, before that time, water pollution was really a huge problem with very little regulation. We now have national drinking water standards. So this means that companies can't deliver water to the public without testing it and making sure that pollutants fall below certain levels and that the pH is within a certain narrow range, which makes it suitable for humans to drink. Any contaminant that's been determined to cause health effects in humans must be designated at a certain level for humans to be able to drink it. Currently, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, has listed 91 potential contaminants that could be found in tap water. Now, this doesn't mean that tap water is bad. The tap water has to have levels below these certain safe limits. And bottled water is often just bottled tap water. So it doesn't mean that it's any better to drink than the water coming directly out of your faucet.